52% of Americans either now own a firearm or they live in a household with a gun. What does that mean? We're going to break down this shocking study that just came out, because for the first time in polling history, this now means that more than half the country lives in a household with a firearm. What does that all mean? How does it break down along political and demographic lines? Guys, let's get into it. So the first thing to understand is that this represents actually an upward trend, which, by definition, it has to if it's at an all-time high. But to wrap some context into this, in 2013, it was 42% of Americans either owned a firearm or lived in a household with a gun. That went up by 4% in 2019 to 46%. And finally now in 2023, we're at 52%. But wait until you see how this broke down along demographic lines, because one particular demographic really surged. Before we get there, guys, there's a secret giveaway going on right now. I can't go into too many details, but it's kind of a remote paper puncher. You can use it to defend yourself. It goes into a holster, all that kind of good stuff. Be sure to check that out in the description box as well as the pinned comment below. Yes, it's absolutely real. It's not a scam. I've met people who told me that they have won this, so be sure to check it out. Let me know how that turns out for you. All right, so back to this. Now let's talk about how this broke down by political party. So between 2004 and 2023, Republicans, or people who identified as Republican according to the polls, saw an increase of 57% firearm ownership to 66%. So it's about a 15% increase across nearly 2 decades. Independents likewise saw an uptick from 41% to 45%. So that's about a 10% increase. Democrats saw the largest gain, going from 33% to 41% across 2004 to 2023, which represents approximately a 24% increase of firearm ownership among individuals who identified as Democrat. Now, let's take a look about this on demographic lines. In 2019 to 2023, so a 4-year span, we saw people who told the surveyors that they were white go from 53% to 56% firearm ownership rates, or about a 5.6% increase. We saw individuals who identified as Black go from between 2019 and 2024, 4 years, 24% in 2019 to 41%. 41%. That's a 70% increase from 24% to 41%. Now, the poll went on to note that almost half, about 48% of those responding, say that they're more concerned that the government will not do enough to regulate access to firearms, i.e. they seem to be in favor of gun control, versus 47% who believe the government will go too far in restricting gun rights. So according to the study, and by the way, the whole study has about a 3% margin of error, according to NBC, 48% seem like they're on the side of gun control, 47% seems like they're on the side of the Second Amendment, more or less. So that's how that all breaks down. And the study did go on to note that this 1-point difference between being in favor of gun control and being against gun control seems to be consistent with their polling over the better part of the last decade. However, you have to imagine that, as they say, demographics is destiny. So if we see a massive surge across different political as well as racial groups and identities who previously maybe not so open owning firearms suddenly arming themselves, then are the predictions that I've had some make to me come true, that firearm ownership, as it was perhaps 50 plus years ago, which was primarily, if I bet you did this poll, would be largely white, male, conservative types. And now we're seeing this shift. I think this is fantastic because the Second Amendment is about everyone that I'm going to be talking about in a moment here. But I just want to remind you that according to a 2017 Pew Research Study, urban counties in America, so we're talking major metropolitan areas, are overwhelmingly Democrat at approximately 62% of residents identifying as Democrat, while 31% say they are Republican. The suburbs are nearly a toss-up these days and vary depending upon which particular metropolitan area you're looking in and which particular election cycle we're in, and rural counties still fall heavily Republican by a margin of about 54% to 38%. So In short, cities are Democrat by about a 31% gap, which is almost a 2-to-1 split between Democrat and Republican, while rural areas are definitely Republican, but by a much smaller, though still significant 16% gap. So guys, really quickly, if you've been enjoying this video, let me in the algorithm know, hit that like button, comment down below to join the discussion. I always enjoy reading those and participating myself. Don't forget about that free giveaway that's going on right now. It's very real. Be sure to hang around to the end to get our always popular quote of the day. Why is this all relevant? Well, of course, I don't expect a lot of favorable coverage about this NBC media poll that just came out. The media would generally prefer, if history is any indication, to harp on how bad firearms are, despite the mountain of evidence to the contrary that we have covered and will continue to cover on this channel. A fair media story would cover that there are far more guns per capita in use in the United States than anywhere else. Yet our firearms are far safer compared to dozens of other countries if we start to do measurements of, in essence, of homicide per firearm owned. The United States firearms are grossly, grossly safer than numerous other countries around the entire world. The problem when it comes to violence is not driven by firearms. The studies bear this out. If firearms drove violence, then more guns should equal more homicide. And particular studies looking at what's the highest and most unsafe countries in the world and regions in the world, we should see correspondingly particularly high rates of firearm ownership. But that simply isn't what we see. The problem is driven by violence that primarily occurs in major metropolitan areas, unlike the suburbs or rural areas where there are far more guns per capita. In short, if guns were the problem, then suburbs and rural farm country would be a killing field, keeping in mind that generally speaking, Republicans are still far more likely to possess a gun than Democrats, and there are far more Republicans in the rural areas particularly, but at least there's parity in the suburbs. But of course, the rural farm country as well as the suburbs are generally not a killing field, not when we start looking at homicide rates compared to major metropolitan areas. And it almost doesn't matter whether we start picking on Chicago, Baltimore, Milwaukee, we're talking about Los Angeles, St. Louis, and so forth. It doesn't matter where we go in the country. These statistics tend to be about the same, and the FBI statistics that follow homicides and crime rate and all this other kind of stuff when we're talking about violent crime and so-called gun-related crime, they all track and say that, look, you're far more likely to experience armed robbery, significant violence, things like that in a major metropolitan area than in a rural area. And let me be clear, what I'm saying when I say that, that is not an anti-city statement. That is the most pro-city statement that you're going to hear today. Because like a doctor treating a tumor, you first need to recognize the tumor when you see it. In other words, we first have to be able to be honest and call ball or strike about where the problems are coming from. Guns are not the tumor. The Second Amendment is not the tumor. Violent crime that correlates to high poverty and low education levels are the consistent engine that drive violent crime. High poverty and low education levels. Doesn't matter where you look in the United States, that's what correlates with crime. Banning guns won't move the needle on high school graduation rates. They will not move the needle on poverty. And I'm yet to see one study that says otherwise. If you want to save lives, save the poor, educate the children. Those of you who have followed me during my time on YouTube know that I really do my best to not get political, even though I'm invariably neck deep in discussing politics. I'm also careful to point out that, frankly, the Second Amendment is not safe with either political party. It's only safe with you, the people. At different times in history, both parties have used and abused the Second Amendment. Right now, it is definitely far safer with one party more so than the other one, and I'm 0% trying to pretend otherwise. My point is that for the Second Amendment to survive, we need to all become politically active. It's not enough to be pro-Second Amendment. We need to be actively pro-Second Amendment. And we need to do so in an educated and respectful way to make us ambassadors, because that's what the Second Amendment deserves. It deserves ambassadors that are backed with history, logic, and statistics. And we need to do that to be able to effectively communicate why people should be pro-Second Amendment. It's not good enough to say shall not be infringed and expect people who maybe are anti-Second Amendment just to say, oh yeah, you're right. Because you know what? They've probably heard that. The Second Amendment deserves the guardians that it will get. The question is, will we all rise to the guardians that the Second Amendment deserves? Or will it be to the wolves and politicians, regardless of whatever party is stepping on it today or tomorrow, and regardless of whether or not we're talking about Washington, D.C., your local state capital, or town, city, or village board? In this life, my experience is that most people reap what they sow. You will get what you deserve. So I have just one question. What kind of Second Amendment do you deserve? Before we get to the quote of the day, don't forget there's that free giveaway going on right now. Also, don't forget to hit that like button if you forgot. And here's our quote of the day. This one comes from medieval philosopher, thinker, and scholar Erasmus. Quote, "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." End quote. Thanks for sticking around. I will see you in the discussion section below and in the next video. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.